Our speaker tonight is Mark Bruzonsky. He holds dual advanced degrees in international affairs and law from Princeton University and New York University, where he was a Root Tilghman Scholar. Mr. Bruzonsky is a journalist and international affairs consultant and the publisher of MiddleEast.org. He has a daily blog that's called Insightful, Irreverent, and Ferociously Truthful. He writes and speaks internationally on Middle East affairs. He wrote a regular bi-weekly newspaper column called From Washington that was published in leading newspapers across the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and Israel. From 88 to 95, Mr. Bruzonsky was the chairperson of the Jewish Committee on the Middle East, an organization of Jewish intellectuals and professionals which was the first American Jewish organization to call for a fully sovereign and independent Palestine. He's written articles and published interviews with everybody from Boutros Ghali to Shimon Peres to Yasser Arafat to Robert Fisk and other important political and intellectual personalities. His work has appeared in more than 35 magazines and newspapers in 11 countries across the U.S., Europe, and the Middle East. He continues to research, observe, and report on both the crucial and the mundane, the realities of life and politics in the Middle East. We're pleased to have him share his insights, to let us know what we don't know, and to prove our understanding of the volatile region and crucial issues of our time. He will speak now, and afterwards we will take questions. Please join me in welcoming to Purdue Calumet and to the Center for Global Studies, Mr. Mark Bruzonsky.
Thank you so much. It really is my great pleasure to be here this evening at Purdue with you, and I'm very grateful to Professor Kamalapur and the Center for Global Studies. Thank you for having me, and thank all of you for coming. My way of expressing this gratitude is to have a very candid, very serious discussion with you this evening about our country's policies in that critical area of the world known as, thanks to the British, the Middle East. Right from the start, let me say, so you can put everything I'm going to share with you tonight in perspective, that overall, I believe our policies in the Middle East not only to be grossly misguided, but to be dangerous to ourselves as well as to others, and to be the result of ominous special interests that are out of control in our country and need to be checked. When we Americans talk about the Middle East and about foreign policy in general, we do so in a kind of sanitized way, making terrible realities and our complicity in causing them much more palatable to ourselves.
It's my great pleasure and honor to welcome all of you to this fifth and last lecture in the Pavani lecture series for this year. For tonight, we have a special guest as speaker, Mark Bruzonsky. He's a special person in that he is a former government major. That's very important. Only smart people major in government. And went to the New York University Law School, where he got the JD degree, and where he also was a so-called Root Tilghman Scholar. Is that right? That's a very coveted position to hold. And then he went to Princeton University at Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, where he got an MPA. But much of his life up to this time has been devoted to journalism, mainly closely observing the Middle Eastern affairs, political, diplomatic, and others. In fact, he is known as one of the closest observers of the Middle Eastern scene. And he has been an honored guest of many countries, ranging from Egypt, Israel to Pakistan, and to Libya and the like. And then he also consulted the UN and other international organizations as well. At the same time, he has published extensively in books and journal articles, newspaper articles. I'll introduce to you tonight's speaker, who will talk on, for tonight for us, topic, From Camp David to 9/11. Did we bring it on ourselves? May I present to you Mark Bruzonsky.
Good evening. It's a bit difficult for me to believe that I left Lawrence over 30 years ago now. And this evening I'm privileged to speak to you for about 30 minutes and trying to sum up what I've learned in these 30 years. But first, before I start that clock, let me acknowledge that, and I truly mean this sincerely, had it not been for this first-class liberal arts education that I received here at this special university, for the self-confidence I was able to begin to develop when I was here, and for the guiding hands and minds of the excellent faculty here, many of whose faces I see, and it's remarkable to me they've changed quite very little. And to you, Chung Do, a very special, sincere thank you. You were my mentor. You opened up for me subjects of inquiry, ways of thinking about and understanding our world, and you did it in a rich and very disciplined way. Plus, of course, I have you and Dr. Pavolny to thank for being here with you this evening. We're all at a major turning point in history. My goal this evening is more to discuss with you what is happening and why it's happening rather than just to lecture to you. It's your turn now. Your turn to ask questions, and your turn to tell me what you think, and your turn to, I'll do the best I can. I'm with you for this one evening. It may not be for another 10, 20, 30 years before I'm back here. So don't feel shy, and please ask the most probing and the most difficult questions that you can, and I'll try to give you the best answer I can.
The recent playing of Osama bin Laden's voice, where he basically was giving permission to anyone around the world to go ahead and strap their bombs on and go to it. Will what happens in the near future kind of say how much power he really has? Or do you think things will happen that he is that powerful? How is it?
He's himself not powerful at all. He's probably in some hut somewhere in the northwest frontier of Pakistan. I've been there. It's a lawless territory. It's like the wild, wild west multiplied many times. Government can't go there. Nobody can go there. He has no power, meaning it's, believe it or not, he thinks he's exercising moral power. He thinks he's exercising historical power. Osama is a very popular name, by the way, for newborns in the Muslim world. The conclusion that we couldn't be silent about Israeli policies. We couldn't be silent about a people, the Palestinian people, fighting for their independence. And most of all, we couldn't be silent about American policy because, make no misunderstanding about it, no matter how many times Secretary Christopher pretends that he's even-handed, no matter how many times President Clinton tells us that he's trying to bring peace and democracy and freedom to the Middle East, the reality is that the United States and Israel work very closely together. The reality is that the United States and Israel work very closely with the most repressive regimes in the region. The reality is that the United States is not for a moment interested in democracy in the Middle East. It's interested in control of the Middle East. And make no mistake about it that the United States is not interested in statehood and independence for the Palestinian people. It's interested in working closely with Israel to control the Palestinian people and to create a situation which can be said to be peace, but in reality is very far from it. But since I'm the first speaker and you're a captive audience, so to speak, for a few moments. I'd like to reflect not just on the last week or two, but in fact on the 10 years of the peace process, or even the 15 or 20 years of the peace process, because many of you may not remember that this really goes back to Camp David in 1978.
My name is Julius Coles. I'm the director of the end. I was at Howard University in Washington. In fact, I met Mark when I was there toward the latter part of my period when I was working at Howard at the Ralph Bunche Center for International Affairs at Howard University, which I helped to establish and did some work there. So I'd like to welcome you to Morehouse. I think you're going to find this a very challenging environment compared to Howard. I think that you'll find it very interesting. We're happy to have you here. Let me give you some idea of Mark's background. Mark and I have one thing in common. We're both graduates of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. And he also went to NYU. He got his law degree from NYU Law School. During the time that he was at NYU, he was a Tilden Scholar, which is quite an honor for being selected for that high award. And he also served as the chief representative to the United Nations of the International Student Movement. Traveled to some 35 countries during that period of time.
After 9/11, it's become the war against terrorism, and it's become a daily focus of all of our lives. Because Osama bin Laden is a product of the peace process in the Middle East. He's a product of the deceptions and the distortions and the lies and the tricks that people in the Middle East don't even call it the peace process.
Tonight, a special Made for Free Speech TV edition of MER-TV, providing an overview of the peace process not often discussed in the U.S. media.
A Palestinian pipe bomb fell with 2 soldiers, mangling one's leg. This occupation is much more insidious because it attempts to defend the Palestinians.
If Arafat, in the view of the Israelis, had outlived his usefulness and it appeared that they have reached that conclusion, who are they trying to get to replace him in terms of carrying on the negotiations with someone they can control or some other person? Second point is going back to the Carter administration and the firing of Andrew Young in terms of his contacts with the Palestinians in the UN. Do you have any background and insights as to what happened? There's the official story and there's the unofficial story. What is the unofficial story?
It's not, the Andrew Young incident is one that I have impressionistically. I was around then, and I was welcome in that White House, in the Carter White House. And I think what happened is, but this is not fact, this is really putting the pieces together. I think the president told Andrew Young to try to push things forward, to do what you should at the UN, to meet with the PLO people if necessary. You're the ambassador of the UN, you can do it. Nobody else in the administration can do it. I think Andrew Young was put out there in hopes that something good would come of this. They meant well. That group meant well, even though what they did turned out to be disastrous. Then when the heat got so strong on the president, from the Israeli Jewish lobby primarily, Carter couldn't stand up to that heat, just like he couldn't stand up and do what he should have done after Camp David. And Andrew Young was sacrificed. I think they maintained a friendship. I don't think I don't know. You could tell me. I don't think they broke personal relations.
No, they haven't.
So my suspicion is the president said, "Look, the political heat is just too great. I can't. I'm sorry. I wanted you to do these things." And maybe Young was ready to move on anyway. I mean, who knows what the personal interests were.
But how did the Israelis find out that Young had met with the
Oh,
Palestinians?
Jesus. The Israelis bugged the White House. I mean, okay, fair enough. You're not going to see it in the New York Times and on CNN, and for guys like me who say it, you're never going to see me on CNN again. The Israelis bugged Clinton and Monica. The Israelis have better intelligence about this stuff than usually we do, but not because we don't have the raw material. Somewhere in the bowels of the NSA is all this raw material, but the Israelis are narrow-focused, and they hone in on things, and they know exactly what their interests are, and they didn't want this thing. At that time, their goal was to find some quizzling Palestinians, from the territories and make a deal with them. They wanted to keep the PLO out of it because the PLO was going to demand a state, and the PLO was going to demand certain things that were written into PLO resolutions. So at that time, forcing the American government to stop its contact with the PLO was very crucial to them. If you were an Israeli citizen, you were arrested. If you went off somewhere in the world, even an academic, and had a meeting with somebody in the PLO, you came back to Israel, they put you in jail. So people obviously didn't do it. As for Arafat, the Israelis don't want a replacement for Arafat. In my view, the Israelis want a series of possibilities. The best possibility for them is a Palestinian civil war where they destroy themselves and kill each other's leadership, and then for the next 10 or 20 years, while the Palestinians are rebuilding, they can continue their settlements and they can continue their conquests and wait for a better day when Arab oil is less important than it has become. It's already becoming less important. That's the first choice. Actually, that's the second choice. The first choice was to get Arafat, before he dies, to sign away Palestinian rights, raise a flag, call it Palestine, but it would really be Bantustans. That was the first choice. Get Arafat to sign the dirty deed, because he's the only one who can sign it. The Palestinian people won't support him anymore, but the world will, because the world will see on the White House lawn all these Arab ambassadors and all this dignity, and the world will say there's been a settlement, and you Palestinians who oppose it, you're all terrorists. Now, they failed for goal one. They're pursuing hard goal two. They're trying real hard to get a Palestinian civil war going. And that's really our policy, because we follow the Israelis on these things. When General Zinni, the peace negotiator, when you're interested in a real peace, you don't send a hardcore Marine general to be, or the CIA chief to be your negotiator. General Zinni is in the Middle East to prepare the war, to prepare the coordination, to prepare what's going to happen with Iraq and with Iran and with Hezbollah. He's there to prepare the military coordination. It has nothing, there is no peace process.
I'd like to introduce Mr. Mark Bruzonsky.
Many of you may find what I will now outline, may find what I'm going to now outline relevant. Many of you young Americans will wonder, how can what is saying be true in view of what is usually said about these issues in the popular mass media in our country? Indeed, I still remember when I was a graduate.
I've been with Mark half the day and it's been fun. He's a very dynamic person. He's not here to entertain, but off the record he has a great sense of humor with a great deal of appreciation, respect, and so forth. Mark Bruzonsky.
Well, Mike, thank you very much. I wish I could be entertaining. We all like to be entertained. We all like to hear jokes. We all like to feel good about things. But unfortunately, the subject you've asked me to come and discuss is a pretty serious subject, and I don't have any jokes to tell. I'm not very optimistic, but I will try to be informative, and I suspect for at least some of you, I'll probably also be rather provocative. We've got to find ways to change the course our governments are on. I'm convinced we're on a confrontation path. It's really up to us. We're the educated, globalized, privileged people. We've got to take our citizenship more seriously, and we've got to find ways to work with each other.
With us, my good friend and colleague, Mark Bruzonsky. He joins us today for this class at St. Mary's College via Skype. There are few people who are not only real experts, but also have had the personal involvement and experiences that Mark has had.
What are our lives about? These are existential questions. What are we then supposed to do? When our country is wrong, are we supposed to say, are we supposed to put a flag in our lapel? And are we supposed to sing the national anthem? And are we supposed to be our country right or wrong no matter what? When our country invades another country, when the excuses for that invasion are blatantly wrong, when we realize we're being propagandized by our own government and by our own institutions, and then we say, oh my goodness, look what happened, 4,000 Americans were killed, and we're $1 trillion in debt, and oh gee, this was a really bad mistake, and we're going to elect somebody else. Well, what about if we stop to say, you mean to say, we made a mistake. That mistake caused 2 million people to die in a country of 26 million? That mistake caused 4 million refugees to be created? Those are called war crimes. Those are called horrendous war crimes. Of course, I'm now referring specifically to Iraq. That's an easy, direct case. A country that wasn't involved in 9/11, a country that didn't have weapons of mass destruction. Did I like the Saddam Hussein regime? Of course not. Was it brutal? Was it thuggish? Did it torture? It was an awful regime. What do you think happens in Saudi Arabia? What do you think was happening in Mubarak's Egypt? Abdullah of Jordan puts a nice smile on and goes to visit his friends in Georgetown. The torture chambers in Jordan are horrendous. The torture chambers in Damascus were and are horrendous. So, before I say anything about Israel, because I'm not an Israeli, I'm an American, we've got to face this predicament of our own country.
I am absolutely pleased and honored today to have with us a very good, excellent friend and colleague of mine, Mr. Mark Bruzonsky. As you can see, he's joining us in this class through Skype. He is not in California. Mark is in Washington, D.C., and has been living there for many years. Therefore, you can tell from the very beginning that Mark is absolutely familiar with all the politics that goes on there. So you will be able to see him, you are, to hear him, and he will be able to see you and hear you as well. But just in a minute or so, let me stress the following. You know, we are living during very amazing, very complex and intricate times. There are many academics out there, writers, officials, so-called experts, who talk about the history and politics of the Middle East and of the world. You see them all the time. But in fact, not everyone you see as an expert is necessarily an expert. And I'm sure you have already gathered this by taking one of my courses. There are a few people who are not only real experts, but also have had the personal involvement and experience, especially in the Middle East, as Mark has had. There are few people who have the ability, who have the courage to come to important conclusions and manage to express these conclusions and these views when it is rather politically and personally difficult, and I should also add costly, to do so, as Mark does. So since his own university days, exactly your age, Mark has made about 200 trips internationally. But perhaps 100 of these trips, if I'm not mistaken, if I am mistaken, Mark will correct me, maybe 100 of these trips have been to countries in the Middle East. More than the times I have been on a plane to go to the Middle East myself. But beyond the vast experiences Mark has, he actually, as I told you, especially students of Middle East politics, Mark has played a pivotal role in a number of historic moments, historic times. Most especially, his private meeting with Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. You all remember Sadat. You read about him. During that meeting, Mark helped convince Sadat to make his trip to Jerusalem, something unfathomable up until that point. Mark also is involved in the authorship of what's known as the Paris Declaration. Paris is much in the news today. I'm sure Mr. Bruzonsky would tell us about the Paris Declaration, which was a very bold attempt many years ago by some of the most important and renowned Jewish leaders in the world to resolve the seemingly irresolvable Arab-Israeli conflict. So, in view of Mark's quite unique background, his involvements and experiences, I've asked him to join us so that we can benefit from his knowledge, from his experience, from his wisdom. I don't want to take much more time, but I've asked Mark not just to discuss with us, important issues we have been studying, but perhaps more importantly to share with us his own insights, his own background, and how he managed to reach the conclusions he has and which he has been writing about, speaking about, on radio, on TV programs, and for many years now. Perhaps the latest was a TV program that Mark was on today.
Hisham, thank you so very much for the opportunity to be with you today, and to all of you students, thank you for the opportunity. And I will try to keep my remarks relatively short because I'm hoping each of you will have questions, and I want to encourage you to ask the most probing and penetrating questions. Don't worry if I agree with you or not. This is your opportunity to ask what you've been wondering about. Yes, Hisham, just a few hours ago, I was in the RT studio down near the press club, and it was a very interesting program, which is totally apropos to what we're going to discuss today. It was about Syria, the war, Russia, America, the Vienna talks, Ambassador Murphy from the Council on Foreign Relations, me here in Washington, and Pepe Escobar from Thailand. He's the roving correspondent of Asia Times. I probably have his name wrong, but Pepe is right. Okay, look, let me just say some things I said this morning to try to put this in perspective. This war that's taking place, these attacks, it didn't start with 9/11. It didn't start last Friday. It started 100 years ago, literally 100 years ago, with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the French and the British secret agreement to divide the Middle East and colonize it. Most people have totally forgotten that the French invaded Syria in 1920. The Arabs set up an Arab government. It was supposed to be the Arab United States. The French invaded, the British went to Palestine, and for the next decade, especially the Syrian revolt of 1925 to 1927, French troops put down the indigenous forces. So we go back 100 years, and to take it to the current moment, 3 days ago, where did President Hollande go to give his address to the joint session of Parliament? For the first time, he addressed the joint session of Parliament in none other than the Versailles Palace. Well, what happened in the Versailles Palace? In 1919, there was a gathering of the Western leaders. The Ottoman Empire had been defeated. Britain, France, the United States, President Wilson, they all created what was called the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. But if you read the most important book about that conference by Professor David Fromkin, a Jewish professor at the University of Boston, I think he's still there, a marvelous book. He titles it the Paris Peace Conference 1919, but what does he subtitle it? The Peace to End All Peace, which is exactly what happened, and we're still living with the results, with the ramifications.
I have two classes combined, for this session, International Relations and Middle East Politics. Thanks, folks. IT, thank you. Mark, as I said, has been involved in many capacities, in many ways. From him, you will get an honest, candid, profound perspective about the issues that we will discuss today.
I'm going to try to do something a little different today. I'm going to try to explain why the system is rigged. In this case, I mean the foreign policy system. I don't mean Donald Trump's view of rigged. But he's right to talk about how the system is rigged, and the other candidate has spent most of her life participating and rigging the system. Now, what do I mean by that? You're interested in foreign policy, you're interested in the Middle East. Why do we have the foreign policy we do in the Middle East? Why are we continually at war? Why are we fighting all these proxy wars? Why, when the general population is against the things we're doing, do we keep doing it and keep double downing on it? I would think that a lot of people will be voting for Trump. They're sick of the system. They don't understand it. They're sick of the politicians. They're willing to vote for anyone who will promise them something different. And when it comes to foreign policy, okay, look, I'm going to say it as I've come to experience it over the last 30 years in Washington. Many of you may be upset or disagree with the things I'm going to say, but the best way to spend our time today is for me to honestly give you the conclusions I've reached and for you to ask the most probing and profound questions you have. Don't be afraid of saying, I disagree with you. Don't be afraid of saying, how could you believe that, Mark? Just when we get to that in a few minutes, let me have it, just like, in a sense, I'm going to let you have it. Our system is rigged because we don't live in a democracy and we don't really have freedom. We live in a kind of oligarchy, a rich person's oligarchy, where the two major parties are funded by the super rich. So the super rich buy the politicians and the parties. Then they also buy the media, the mainstream media, which explains to us supposedly what those policies are, but skip increasingly speakers like me who were very welcome years ago when I was much more part of the establishment and didn't really understand things. I was quite naive myself. I came to Washington, went to all the embassies, went to all the think tanks, wrote reports, traveled around the world, met presidents and prime ministers, only to realize many years later that I was still living in Plato's cave, that I thought I had escaped. I had just moved to a different room where there was a little bit of sunshine. Okay, the foreign policy system is rigged because the special interests run my city. The special interests aren't just the Israelis and the Jewish lobby, even though they are the most effective and the most profound here. There's the Saudi lobby, there's the military-industrial complex lobby. There's so many different interest groups that have the politicians in their pocket and manipulate them. When it comes to the Middle East, which is one of your primary interests and mine, let's just look at both parties. Who's the biggest contributor to the Republican Party? Sheldon Adelson. What does he declare his biggest interest in the world is? Relations with Israel. More arms, more support, more vetoes at the UN, more war preparations. His antithesis in the Democratic Party, actually they're in bed together in some ways, is Chaim Saban, the billionaire who has funded the Clintons, and the billionaire who is the primary contributor to the Democratic Party. If you look at the system here in Washington, you find revolving doors. People go between government and lobbies and the military-industrial complex. They spend their lives doing this. A good example that I know the best would be Dennis Ross, for instance, who has served in government. Then he goes to the Israeli lobby think tank. Wolf Blitzer qualifies for this. Most people don't realize Wolf was sent to CNN in the early days after working for AIPAC and the Israeli lobby and the Jerusalem Post. Martin Iddig, who runs the Brookings Institution, the think tank of the Democratic Party here, is also an Israeli lobby protege. They brought him here. These are careerists. They've taken over the media, they've taken over the think tanks, but it's even worse than that. They intimidate and blackball anybody who speaks up against them. They spend so much time undermining anybody who will speak up against them and won't play ball with them. Washington is more fearful than ever before. People are afraid to make phone calls and arrange lunches with each other because they think their emails and their phone calls, if they leak anything, will eventually be found out. General Cartwright, the 4-star general, tried to stop the New York Times from reporting the Stuxnet virus a few years ago. But since he said things to the New York Times guy that the New York Times guy says helped him confirm the story, even the 4-star general in retirement is now being sent to prison and going to pay a big fine. The idea is to have everybody fearful, everybody looking over their shoulder. A very narrow group of people run our foreign policy, and they run it terribly badly. We've killed millions of people since 9/11. I'm not today going to go into the 9/11 story because that would be in itself, I'll just say the government story isn't true. You don't have to believe me. The two chairmen of the committee, of the 9/11 committee, 2 years after their report, issued a statement and a report that said we were set up to fail. They acknowledged that their report was a failure, but they didn't blame themselves. They blamed how they were set up. That's a long story in itself. So here we are. Hisham, you want me to predict what's going to happen? Quite literally as we speak, Hillary is being pummeled. She's hemorrhaging. The FBI people are leaking things. This morning, the big leak, and it's a big one, is that the FBI, two FBI people have leaked to Fox News that they've actually been investigating the Clinton Foundation for a year, and that they're getting close to indicting the Clinton Foundation, so the leakers say, except the Attorney General, who oversees the FBI, is doing everything she possibly can to prevent that, hoping that Hillary will be elected, and once elected, will be able to stop the investigations. I am no supporter of Donald Trump. For me, he's a psychopath. He's a narcissist. He is an extremely dangerous man. But that doesn't mean that everything he says is wrong. When he talks about the need for term limits, when he talks about the need to stop the revolving door between government and lobbyists for at least 5 years, he actually says some things reasonable. When he talks about not blaming the Russians for everything, and he's correct in a few things, but he never actually gets to the heart of it, and he never actually, he would be so dangerous as our president, not to mention what would happen to the Supreme Court and other things. So reluctantly and with great hesitation, I'm not going to hide, since we're just a few days away from it, Hillary becomes our savior, no matter how much we have to hold our nose, no matter how much we have to realize how corrupt not only she and her husband and her party are, but we don't have an immediate choice other than her. But we should wake up the next day, breathe a sigh of relief that we dodged the bullet, and realize this doesn't change how bad our system is. She will not be able to govern. She's bleeding. She's literally bleeding politically, like a boxer in a ring who comes up and they hold her hand high and say, "You win." But we're all losing. We're all losing because our system is corrupted, not on election day, but all the time. It's big money, big influence, special interest groups, and then the two areas that are supposed to protect us from this by at least exposing it, the media and academia, have unfortunately been quite co-opted. If it weren't for the internet, if it weren't for alternative news sources, things would be much worse than they are. The establishment media, nevertheless, is our dominant media. They control the debates, they control the networks, they control what most people see. And academia has been tremendously damaged over the years because government has figured out ways to get its hooks into universities with all kinds of grants. And the lobbies and the special interests, here I have my own experience with what I call the Israeli Jewish lobby. They have figured out ways to intimidate and to make everybody worried, just like producers worry who they're going to put on TV because they're going to get calls from these lobbies and maybe lose their job. Academics worry, especially before they get tenure, but even after they get tenure. Can I say this? Can I tell my students this? What happens if somebody records it? What happens if they tell the lobby, which has people literally assigned to every university all over the country? But I don't want to just emphasize the Israeli Jewish lobby. It's the one I know the best. It's the one I come from. The Saudis play a terrible role. The military industrial plays a terrible role. If you watch the news programs on TV, who advertise? Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, the big quote-unquote defense contractors do the advertising, and they support the programs we all watch. So I ask you in the few moments we have together to please allow me to give you my perspective in a clear and admittedly a very pointed way. In a sense, I'll also be summarizing what I've learned in about 200 trips abroad since my own student days. I realize many of you are not going to agree with or even accept what I have concluded, but I thank you in advance for the opportunity to be here tonight to join these two distinguished persons who play such important roles at this exceptional university and, in fact, in our country. Though what happened a few years ago on 9/11 was certainly not the start of the conflict that now dominates all of our lives, the impact it has had on our society, including events here at Princeton, has become overreaching. I say it was not the start because one can trace what happened on 9/11 back to many other critical historical events from which it was spawned. And since he was the president of this university, before he came to Washington as the president of the country, I'll start by recalling the famous Paris Peace Conference of Woodrow Wilson's time. Though called a peace conference, the result was anything but. Back then, the victorious Western powers essentially divided the defeated Ottoman Empire into many artificial nation-states and sheikdoms, which still remain today. Then, the legitimizing theme was self-determination, which of course was not really to be. Much as today, ad nauseum, but disingenuously, the themes are democracy and freedom. It's crucial to remember that at that time, the people of what we Westerners named the Middle East had been promised independence as an Arab nation, only to find themselves sold out by the secret British-French Sykes-Picot Agreement, and then confined in neocolonialism, termed mandates, and legitimized by Wilson's own League of Nations. That 1918 Paris Peace Conference turned out, in fact, to be the peace to end all peace. The subtitle, in fact, of Professor David Fromkin's remarkable book about that crucial period, which is the precursor to our own. Or in view of the current issues, today we could skip forward and start with the largely democratic and secular attempt to reform Iran in 1953, one which the CIA then undid, putting the Shah back on the throne until 25 years later a traumatized country threw him out. We, the United States, then took the Shah in. Iranian students then responded by sacking the U.S. Embassy and taking hostages. And in a sense, their revolution then turned into our Reagan Revolution and to today's Iran. Or we could start with the region-shaking 67 war, or for that matter, the U.S.-sponsored birth of Israel 20 years before that, or with Jimmy Carter's peace conference of 78, which also became a peace to end all peace, because what followed was the assassination of Anwar Sadat, the Lebanese Civil War, the Iran-Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the invasion-occupation of Lebanon, which midwifed Hezbollah, the anti-occupation intifada, which midwifed Hamas, and which led to the era of suicide bombers that we're in now. The crucial point is 9/11 didn't come out of the blue and did have causes, and for many, reasons and justifications, as much as American politicians and commentators refused to discuss this backdrop and how the stage was set. Huge numbers of people, in total millions of Arabs and Muslims, had already been maimed and killed in this ongoing convoluted conflict, laced with superpower proxy wars, Zionist and Muslim ideologies, corrupt repressive Arab client regimes, and the never-ending Israeli-U.S. occupation of the Palestinians. And let's be clear about this. Among the main reasons most American politicians and commentators don't talk about any of this and don't connect the vital dots that could lead to both understanding and conflict resolution is because most of those who are allowed center stage are either in the pay of special interest groups or have little experience with the peoples of the region and little serious knowledge of the culture and history about which they are so incessantly chattering. One of your own current history professors, one whom I just happened to grow up with in Duluth, Minnesota, a long time ago, has this to say, in an interview that's on his website, at the Princeton website, he has this to say. There are rules of the game in every society. We have to get inside a foreign culture and understand internally how it works. In 1940, we were confronting what we thought was fanatical emperor worship from the Japanese. They seemed to have no contact with Western civilization. They were inscrutable, incomprehensible. Today, we're describing our current enemy, Islamic fundamentalism, in much the same way. Whether it's good or bad, there are ways that Islamic fundamentalists see the world. To call them terrorists and fanatics is simply to say they're different from us and we don't understand them. But clearly, we've got to delve much more deeply. And so in the few remaining minutes, and I do have these prepared remarks because I thought this conference was so important that I should think through what I would have the one opportunity to say with you. So for the few remaining moments, let's try to delve much more deeply. And in a sense, I'll be summarizing my perspective on what I think has happened here at Princeton in the years since I've been gone, all, of course, in the afterglow now of 9/11. Some may still think that this is just a speaker's controversy here at Princeton, one which the recent 75th anniversary highlighted. But actually, it's far, far more than that. What has happened here at Princeton, I believe, is in the end the result of the serious and growing financial, political, and social pressures educational institutions now face in our country. Pressures which in turn largely determine what kind of people are put in positions of authority and what kind of decisions they're encouraged, if not forced by circumstances, to make. What has happened here at Princeton, all the more so since 9/11, it seems to me, is not by accident, but rather by design. Beyond the general pressures facing all major universities, you have today a Woodrow Wilson School fearful of losing a major part of its endowment, and as a result, courting power and money more than ever. For those of you who haven't seen the front page Wall Street Journal article today, that's just a fortuitous circumstance that happened. It had nothing to do with this forum. And yes, in my view...
Beforehand, you are clear about that.
Well, I thought maybe the students were more powerful than I realized, but in my view, and with all respect to Dean Slaughter for the positive things she may have done here of which I may not be aware, Woody Wilson and Princeton are now playing big time, the big money and big power game. And it all comes at the expense of the rigorously independent intellectual and educational pursuits that should be foremost in mind, but are not. Furthermore, the person most responsible for choosing speakers, handing out awards, and selecting faculty in the past few years here at Princeton and at the Woodrow Wilson School appears to me to be using the university as a stepping stone to future personal and political power in Washington should that opportunity strike. Others have done so. The two that come to mind most are Paul Wolfowitz, who was at SAIS, and Condi Rice, of course, who was at Stanford. The major problem, though, is that when universities, the very places that are supposed to reflect independence of thought and analysis and true expertise, become so dependent on corporate, government, and lobby-connected largesse, then one of the major centers of honest education and knowledge in our society becomes severely compromised. That, in short, is what I think has happened here at Princeton, and most of all at the Wilson School. This situation cannot be remedied by a single forum or by inviting an occasional dissident intellectual like Noam Chomsky to give a talk. If you really want to remedy the situation, there are ways you can. But very frankly, I'm quite sure the powers that be are not going to allow this to happen. You could, for instance, establish and separately fund a special, maybe student-run program specifically designed to bring the very best independent academics, social critics, and expert journalists to Princeton from around the world. And you could and should make a point of bringing such people together at the same time as those who hold power. Then you will have your Socratic dialogue. Then you will have the world-class people at a world-class institution that can truly educate and discuss and debate the real issues of our time. But I stress the word independence, for the notion that the span of major guests should range from senior government officials to top personalities in the other mirror party competing to be senior government officials is really quite a ludicrous notion. Such a notion plays well in corrupted and lobby-infested Washington, but it shouldn't be allowed at a world-class university, especially with regard to major international issues. Because when it is allowed, not only are all of you students shortchanged at a very special and formative time in your lives, but all of us as a society are dangerously shortchanged for our collective future. For we don't need world-class universities to invite the very same power and money speakers and faculty that the government and lobby think tanks and political departments invite. There's already far too much of that. We do need universities to invite speakers and to engage faculty based on their demonstrated serious knowledge, expertise, independence, and critical thinking. It used to be much more that way. It doesn't seem it's that way any longer, certainly not here at Princeton, from what I've experienced, not only at the 75th, which I attended, but at the series of seminars that has been held in Washington for the past year. I also stress from around the world, rather than nearly always turning to those sponsored by or accepted by the powers that be in our country. For to really understand what is happening in our world, you have to both hear from and engage others who see things very differently and who are outside your own blinders and restraints. People who are not subjected to or controlled by the pressures for political correctness and advancement that now so dominate our society. Just from my own contacts, I can quickly think of people who could have brilliantly engaged and educated all in attendance at the 75th celebration. You may not know some of these personalities, which is just part of the problem, but I assure you they are all very much valued, respected, and in great demand throughout the world, even if not here at Princeton. Robert Fisk, Harold Pinter, Mohammed Hakel, Arundhati Roy, Mohammed Mahathir, Amira Haas, Nan Almagor, Haider Abdel Shafi, John Filger, Boutros Ghali, the list could go on. Indeed, for the 75th anniversary, where everyone was force-fed a non-stop diet of self-serving top government officials without even one single major independent academic or journalist or political analyst. Any of these persons I've just mentioned would have made an immensely needed contribution and, in fact, changed the nature of the proceedings. For there is a reason our current Secretary of State even now says she was so surprised by the Hamas electoral victory a few days ago. Right. Not to mention her insistence before Congress that no one imagined that anyone would use airplanes as they did on 9/11. The reality is quite otherwise, in fact. Many independent experts knew, predicted, and explained what was to come. She just didn't talk to them and didn't call on them. And when it comes to 9/11, no less a flag waver than Tom Clancy had written a novel that opens with an airplane diving into the Capitol during a State of the Union address. So just what kind of a self-isolating, apologist, and unaware world is Miss Rice, even now, living in? And there's a reason why Rice's predecessor, also recently honored here at Princeton, even after he perpetrated such a great historic hoax on all of us, the third anniversary, by the way, was 2 days ago. And I'm not using the term hoax as my own. Quote, I participated in a hoax on the American people, the international community, and the United Nations Security Council, unquote. That's what Colin Powell's own chief of staff at the State Department finally confessed in public just last Friday, in fact. The result of this, and many other cruel hoaxes coming from our government, is the dangerous polarization, dumbing down, militarization, and in some very troubling ways, the neo-fascist developments in our own society. This on top of the disastrous Iraqi invasion occupation, which has caused so much death and suffering, now cost nearly $500 billion, squandered so much American credibility, created so much more hatred around the world, and badly weakened and tarnished our military forces as well, once again. All of these issues should be seriously, vigorously, and continually discussed, debated, dissected, and analyzed at this world-class center of higher education. But instead, whatever the excuses, and frankly, these are not excuses that I find very credible. This reminds me of many forums in Washington where many of us just sit in the audience scratching our head at the things we're asked to believe about why things happened in the way we're told they happened, and then we find out when we have more information that's not quite the way it really was. So instead, we've been subjected to a parade of cabinet secretaries, ambassadors, and generals, one after the other, all part of the same team, and all offered nearly a free ride. This is not, in my view, in the nation's service. It is in the government's service. This is surely not in the service of all nations. It is a very limiting and nationalistic approach which just further cuts off Princetonians from our world as it really is. And this parade of the powerful, financed by the special interests, simply does not reflect the real world we all must live in, and in which our country must now desperately find its way anew before it is too late. Thank you.